This presentation is one of 9 given by myself and other members of the Few Forgotten Women team during this year's All About That Place. The Few Forgotten Women are a group of 12 researchers who originally got together during lockdown to support and encourage each other with our research. We soon found that many of us had some remarkable women either in our ancestry or as part of our one place study, and all these women had one thing in common. Their life stories were lost in the maze of the male-dominated historical narrative, and we decided that their stories needed telling. So the Few Forgotten Women team was born. Over the last year or so, we've expanded the project to include our popular collaborative Forgotten Women Fridays. So why not pop along to our website to find out more and read the many stories of the women now no longer forgotten. One of our Fridays was related to my one place study, the Cheshire County Training College in Crewe, which opened in 1908. Volunteers researched the lives of the first intake of female students, resulting in some extraordinary stories, again, all published on our website. The main characteristic feature of the training undertaken at the college, and one that set it apart from others in the country, was the great importance attached to practical training. Students, the Education Committee thought, should learn to teach in the rough and tumble of an actual school rather than in the confines of a college, and therefore spent around 4 months in the classroom at one of the local primary schools. The primary school teacher had to be all things to all pupils, and in an earlier 1920 student magazine, one of the female students penned this lovely little ink drawing of herself on the way to her first block of teaching practice. This became a famed image, and in later years, a male student recreated it for the local press. While on teaching practice, the students were expected to carry out a series of child studies. These reports were written on children from diverse backgrounds and social standings, and were very in-depth pieces of work. A number of these reports have survived and make very interesting and, it has to be said, sobering reading. Not only because they tell us how children were taught in the early years of the 20th century, but because they also act as a reflection on the social conditions of the time. Now, for this short presentation, I've changed the name of the child to Angela Smith and that of the student to Betty in order to anonymise and protect their identities. And what follows is perhaps not that a surprising tale of life for a working-class child in a rural area. Indeed, one that may resonate with your own family history research. The information presented is taken from Betty's notebook, written in 1938, and as I noted on my opening slide, reflect her thoughts and concerns at the time, and as a warning, contains mentions of corporal punishment and a certain degree of child neglect. Student teachers tended to be given the menial tasks, which included playground duty, in all weathers, especially at the start of school. So let's follow Betty as she corrals the children into their classroom for the start of their day. Angela was born in March 1932, which makes her just about 6 when this study was carried out. She was considered by Betty to be quite a bright child, but generally quiet, with a very timid nature. Angela was never very well dressed and seemed to have no pretty toys or trinkets of her own, ones that most of the other girls of her age possessed and brought into class with them. Angela usually came to school in quite a dishevelled state and invariably dirtied her clothes during the day. Her home life was considered by Betty not to be an inspiring one, although most of her siblings seemed intelligent enough. Her eldest brother having won a scholarship for the local grammar school, not that he ever attended, much more important that he went to work and earned some extra money for the family. Angela's older sister, despite doing very well at primary school, had already got a job in service, secured for her by her mother, which Betty thought was a shame, as the young lady in question had a good hand when it came to writing and a sharp mind, which could certainly be put to much better use than in the scullery. Angela was next in age, followed by two younger sisters and a baby brother. Angela and her siblings never seemed dressed adequately for the weather, especially during the winter months, and regularly came to school barefooted. The father was a bricklayer, often out of work and of a surly disposition. It was obvious to Betty from her dealings that she had with Mrs. Smith that Angela and the rest of her children, as well as Mrs. Smith herself, were all very afraid of him. Angela would frequently and very innocently reveal things that exposed the treatment of the family by their father. On one occasion, Betty noticed some large bruises at the top of the young girl's legs. Angela casually saying that because she had failed to obey her father's wishes the previous evening, so she didn't bring him his mug of tea as fast as he liked, she got the strap. Another time, when the class were discussing pets, Angela said that they had once had a kitten in the house, given to them by their father's foreman. The children had called it Bambi, and the father had promised it would have a good home. However, every time the scrap of a thing went near the fire, while Mr. Smith was sitting in his chair, he would kick it away, and the creature became so dreadfully injured that it eventually had to be destroyed. Angela's father obviously liked to assert himself as master of the house. He had the best chair by the fire, one that no one else was allowed to sit in. His meals were always served to him before the rest of the family, and his frequent visits to the local hostelry all made for a generally unhappy home. Betty writes that Angela told her, "Dad says dinner has to be at 1, so we must have it ready for 1 or someone gets it, and Mam cries when he gives one of us the strap." Betty considered that having such a domineering father, together with his treatment of their mother, probably made a deep impression on the children's minds, and she felt that this was partly the cause of Angela's timid nature. When Betty first arrived at the school, Angela seemed almost too shy to speak, but after a while appeared to adopt Betty, trotting around after her at her heels during playtime and dinner time, and chatting incessantly when the two were alone. If another child approached, Angela would revert to her habitual silence. Angela constantly asked to be allowed to help the teachers and seemed very intent on any task she was given to do. It was as if she was suddenly needed by the adults and felt that she was being useful, and this obviously instilled a feeling of security in the child, one that she so desperately craved. During their frequent talks, Angela would mention a big doll with eyes that opened and closed, and she seemed very attached to the doll. And it wasn't until later that Betty discovered that it had been given to Angela by another member of staff out of pity, as Angela had not a single plaything of her own. Angela kept the doll at school rather than take it home, as her father would probably try and sell it, and she lavished a lot of attention on the toy, probably all the affection that she would have liked for herself. Betty also discovered that Angela's mother was kept very busy at home with her youngest child, who was quite sickly. The girls of the house having to help a lot and were often absent from school for this reason. Angela also seemed to be very fond of her baby brother and was often seen out in the evenings and at weekends, pushing him in his rickety pram around the village and sitting with him on her knee by the pond on the village green. Once you got to know Angela, she was an affectionate child and in need of affection in return. The lack of this at home made Angela seek out the company of adults rather than her peers while at school. Betty reported it was always very difficult to persuade Angela to go and play with other children. Instead, she insisted that she'd rather stay inside and help the staff with anything she could. When the headmaster visited the class, she would attempt to monopolize him and always engineer it that she would sit next to him. The lack of any kindness at home from her father, Betty thought, drove Angela to seek this attachment, perhaps seeing him as an ideal father figure. One of the greatest problems with Angela and her siblings was they were often arrived at school in a dirty state, and the headmaster frequently sent one or more of them home with a note to their mother to ask that they be cleaned up and returned to school for the afternoon session. However, once the children were sent home, they never came back for the rest of the day. The school nurse visited frequently to keep watch on several of the children in the school, Angela and the family included. And again, it was a common occurrence for the Smith children to be sent home armed with a note explaining the necessity to keep them clean in order to prevent the spread of infection to the other children. The oldest Smith child had at one time large sores on his scalp, sores that Mrs. Smith seemed incapable of controlling, and her remedy being to shave the child's head with a razor on a weekly basis, obviously exacerbating the situation. Nits and conjunctivitis plagued the household, and the children, especially in the winter months, were absent for long periods, despite visits by the inspector. The mother insisting that they would return the following day if only she had enough decent pairs of boots for each child. Betty noticed that when it was wet, the younger children, who wore the oldest pairs of boots, were unable to keep their feet dry and often had deep open wounds and blisters on their feet. Angela herself was, in the winter, regularly found sitting on her own, crying in pain. The inspector reported back to the headmaster that the house was in a bad state of repair and that the children all generally slept in one bed together, a flea-infested straw mattress covered in Hessian sacking. But despite all these woes, Angela was always focused during lessons, at great pains to do well and please her teachers. Her work in the 3 R's was good, and she liked to recite little poems and rhymes that she'd learnt by rote, and had quite a sweet singing voice. During PE lessons, Angela joined in, but the state of her underclothing meant that, for decorum's sake, she was often had to be asked to refrain from taking part in games that included some measure of skipping or jumping. At one point during her teaching practice, Betty found out that Angela, because she didn't have any nice things of her own, had succumbed to temptation and on a number of occasions had taken other children's possessions. Betty didn't think that the child was entirely at fault. After all, she wrote, it must be difficult to resist temptation when Angela had so little of her own. Betty felt sorry and upset that this had happened, because the stigma that was then attached to these matters lasted such a long time. She hoped that the other children would perhaps eventually understand, as Angela was a helpful and intelligent child, and with the correct amount of care and attention, Betty was sure she would turn into a lovely young girl. Regardless of this hard start in life, not unusual, I'm sure, for the end of the interbellum years, I discovered, as I researched Angela's life, that she was in service from the age of 14 in a large house, but in her early 20s moved on to train as a nurse at the Crewe Memorial Hospital. She later married and moved away from Cheshire. She had 3 children, one of whom was the first in the Smith family to attend university, and who later went on to teach a science-based subject as a professor at a Russell Group university. Angela sadly passed away only a few years ago. She had been a widow for 15 years and doted on her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And I feel sure that Betty, who wrote this child study on Angela in 1938, would be really pleased to know that she did turn out to be that lovely young girl she thought she would. And I'm also sure that Betty would have been very proud of the woman that Angela became.